The baseball season concluded earlier this week. And there were many Mets fans like me that were rooting for the Yankees. And sadly, it was not to be. Bishana Haba'ah. May there be a Subway series next year. Baseball has been in the air in the sanctuary as the previous two Shabbat evenings. There were important games going on. And I was impressed by a number of you who approached me during these weeks reminding me that the first words from the Torah prove that God is a baseball fan. For the first words of the Torah are, in the big inning. Turns out the start of Genesis includes many stories of beginnings, including this week's portion. Parshat Noach is famous for the story of the flood and the ark. And later on in the portion, there is the story of the Tower of Babel and the beginning of how languages came to be. And in its last verses, chanted so beautifully by our cantor, we see the beginning stories of the first Jewish people, Abraham and Sarah. In this section of the Torah, their names are slightly different, but for tonight, I'll use the names we eventually call them. We first learn about this dynamic duo through the Torah introducing us to Abraham's father, Terah, and he is the patriarch of the family. In terse verses, actually, all of them were just chanted by the cantor. We get bits and pieces about Terah's family. We learn that Abraham is one of three brothers and they all lived in the land of Ur. Many scholars believe Ur was located next to the river Euphrates in ancient Mesopotamia. And as a brief aside, archaeological exploration of Abraham's hometown has uncovered signs of a massive flood, which was perhaps the inspiration for the stories found in the beginning of this portion. What little we learn about Abraham's family is critically important to the Abraham we eventually get to know. And this information even gives us a new way to comprehend God. Most significant is that Abraham had a brother who married and had 3 children before dying too young. After this brother dies, Abraham's father decides to set out from Ur, and he declares, we're moving to a new land, and the name of the new land is Canaan. What the Torah does not say is that the journey from Ur to Canaan, which is another name for ancient Israel, was at least a 1,000-mile trek. And I have a map with the route, if you'd like to see it after. Imagining this moment, Malachi Martin wrote, there was only one way by land from Ur to Canaan, the arc of fertile terrain, a long finger of rice and cotton and citrus and melon, corn and dates, figs and grapes, a curving miracle of green arching its way in the midst of an impassable desert waste, the Fertile Crescent. 600 miles in, a little more than halfway there, this week's Torah portion states, when they had come as far as the city of Haran, they settled there. In other words, for reasons the Torah does not explain, Terah and his clan did not continue on to Canaan. This week's Torah portion concludes, Terah died in Haran. Immediately following are the words of the next portion. God calls Abraham saying, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And yet we know from this week's portion, Abraham had already left his native land of Ur. He was no longer in his father's house, at least no longer in his father's house in his hometown. He was living in a relatively new city, a city his father and extended family had never planned to settle in. But as we know in life, unexpected things happen. How many of us have stories of how our families wound up living where they did? How many of us have tales of how I got to Great Neck or Madison or Tacoma? Our lives have included unanticipated turns and settlements. In his book, Voices from Genesis, our beloved teacher, Rabbi Norman Cohen, imagines Abraham telling his story this way. I grew up in southern Mesopotamia. I had 2 younger brothers, all of us married. We had every intention of living out our lives there in this rather large city near the mouth of the Euphrates River. Tragically, however, my brother died, and my family never recovered. Soon, my father decided that the family would leave and start a new life elsewhere in Canaan. In a few weeks, all of us packed our belongings and followed our father as he set out on the arduous journey up the Fertile Crescent. We wanted to create a new life in faraway Canaan. After what seemed like an endless trek, we reached the city of Haran in northern Mesopotamia. This would be our resting place for a few weeks before we continued south to Canaan, but as it turned out, we never left. My father actually decided that we would settle in Haran. Sadly, this became his permanent resting place when he died. I don't know why my father didn't continue his journey to Canaan. After all, that was his dream. From the very beginning, perhaps he was just too tired, or maybe he was pleased with what he found in Haran. Whatever the reason, I knew that one day I would complete the journey. I would fulfill his dream. The Torah frames God's communication to Abraham after his father's death quite simply. Just after Terah dies, God says to Abraham, "Go forth." But having the backstory on Abraham, I cannot help but wonder if these iconic words of God to Abraham are also communicating to us in a more complex way that God can be found in our connection to our loved ones and their journeys. That God can be experienced through our link to the people who got us to where we are today, who shared their hopes and dreams with us, who put us in a position to set forth out on our own paths that are inextricably bound to them. Just for a moment, reflect on your path, your journey. Whether you are 9 or 79, think about how you got to where you are today and the people who were influential in helping you get here. I know, like Abraham, my parents and sibling profoundly influenced me. And there were others, teachers, mentors, friends. Who are the people on your list? In the beginning, with the story of Abraham, we learn that God can be found and experienced in our connection to our loved ones. Let us recognize that the divine resides in our closest relationships, and may this strengthen, inspire, and comfort us as we go forth.